I'm Sarah Horrocks. I'm the director of the Connected Learning Centre, and this evening I'm going to be in conversation with Mark Martin, who is a secondary teacher in computer science and an EdTech specialist, and also co-founder of UK Black Tech, and also joined by my colleague Caitlin McMillan, who is a teaching and learning consultant at the Connected Learning Centre. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment and show you the principles for remote learning. Just move the bar. So this is part of the Blend Ed site, which is a programme of support for teachers, professional development for teachers, with the support of IBM, and it's all about the pedagogy of blended learning. So looking at all of those different mixing together of the face-to-face in the traditional classroom, but using digital tools, online learning, remote learning, as we're all now very familiar with, mixing everything up together in a kind of hybrid blended fashion. But these 6 principles of remote learning we've put together based largely on the work of the Canadian academics Garrison and Anderson, a colleague of ours, the parent charity that manage us, Education Development Trust. Tony McAlevey wrote a report for DFID about remote learning, and kind of what do we already know about it? What did we already know about it before the pandemic? And then how has it been playing out, and what are we learning all of the time? So these 6 principles are a sense of belonging, so that it's really important for students to know that they are part of a school, part of an educational institution, part of a group, and that they feel that sense of community. We know that teacher presence is really important, and we're going to be talking more about all of these later, but that kind of social aspect of the teaching and the relationship with the teacher, we know the teacher is absolutely central to any learning. Then the student-teacher dialogue. We know that with remote learning, it can be quite complex to do assessment and feedback. We have to do it in a much more considered way and a much more planned way than we do with that kind of constant to and fro that we have in the traditional classroom. Then engagement with peers, obviously really important and much more difficult. One of the biggest challenges that we're all facing at the moment. How do you engender a sense of students being able to communicate with each other when they're doing it online? But they need also to be part of a community of inquiry, to feel that they're learning together and they're learning from each other, not just from the teacher. And of course, all of these things make up learning design. So it's kind of, lesson planning by another name really, but kind of, again, done in a much more explicit way when it's for online learning. So let me show you a little bit of our website. So on there, we've got several different sections. We've got lots of resources, advice and guidance, lots of things that we've created ourselves, but also lots of things that we've collected and curated. And of course, things like the recent Ofsted report, DFE guidance and reports, lots of information reports from the Education Endowment Foundation and many other organisations, but also things we've created ourselves. And then the other thing that we've really wanted to do with this site and this programme is to make sure that there's a real sense of teacher voice. So we have getting on for 100 interviews with teachers in kind of small sound bites where we've had conversations with teachers and school leaders about how they've been approaching both remote online learning, but also blended learning, thinking about when maybe some students are learning from home, there might be bubbles at home, but also students in the class, which is what we have at the moment. So these are the different elements of the site. And then we've also got a kind of micro learning site. So we've got webinars such as this, which people can book on. And then we've also got kind of self-paced learning, again, in these kind of like micro learning chunks. So that's a little introduction to Blended. And Mark is really our kind of teacher voice and face of Blended. And what Mark has been doing is he has been setting a theme every week on the site around, particularly at the moment, kind of thinking about kind of remote learning, but blended learning more widely too. And he's been setting a theme each week and discussing that and drawing on his own experience in school. So I'm going to hand over now to Caitlin, who's then going to bring Mark in terms of the work that he's been doing on Blended.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, so it's over to me really to introduce Mark kind of properly. So it would be, I think, a little bit churlish of me just to be here sort of explaining you to you, Mark. So do you want to do a quick intro to yourself and kind of what your role's been in the initialization of the Blend Ed program?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Caitlin and Sarah, and really privileged to be a part of this journey that we're on in terms of exploring blended learning and basically how do we empower teachers in a time of crisis and a time of lots of uncertainty to really think about empowering their students and so on. In terms of Blend Ed in my contribution to the platform has been around providing some practical advices in terms of what happens in my lessons, what's happening in my school environment, and then what's happening in across the whole landscape. Because working in education for 10 plus years, you get to understand the different kind of levels of what is required to really make a difference in terms of this online and remote learning piece that hopefully we're going to discuss more in as we proceed through this presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. As you said, we are going to discuss that further throughout this session. But first up, we thought it would be good to kind of demonstrate what you've just been talking about in terms of your contribution to the Blend Ed site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share my screen and just demonstrate one of the videos that Mark's done for us about those 6 principles that Sarah was talking about. So this one is about dialogue and encouraging dialogue between students and teachers.
My name is Mark Martin, and today I want to talk about teacher dialogue and how to do that effectively. A couple months ago, I gave out an instruction online to basically come up with a design poster because I was teaching creative media at the time. And I thought that I assumed that the students would have known the instruction that I'd given them and basically kind of left the platform open for them to bring any comments or any kind of suggestions. And what I found is that no one responded. And I had to look at the way I was kind of communicating with the students. Did I give them enough opportunities? Did I give them enough pathways to be able to do that? And when I asked for the working second time, there was a massive improvement. Why? Because I felt that the communication channels and the dialogue that I formed within my sessions was able to empower students and give them confidence in terms of when they were stuck. So I'm going to kind of provide some few tips on how I've done it and how you could potentially use it in your practice. So one of the things that I would recommend if you're working online or offline is around how do students contact you? Do they contact you via email? Do they contact you via the VLE chat messaging system? Do they contact you by writing a letter? How do students contact you in today's kind of norm? And then also what you got to think about is then how do you respond to that? How do you give feedback? Because when you're in a classroom, you can give real quick verbal feedback. But if you're not in a classroom, how do you do that effectively? How do you support them through that process? And one of the things that I've been exploring is around, can we role play or can we create a cheat sheet for creating dialogue with our students? So if our students are stuck, they've got a menu of ways of how they can respond to the teacher and also how they can respond to the work that they are trying to complete. And then also when you are online and doing the role play or you're actually leading a session, it might be that you might want to use emojis. a thumbs up if things are well, thumbs down if they didn't understand it, a heart if they love what they're hearing, or and so forth. So you can be creative in terms of the different functionality of these tools if you are teaching online and you are trying to get that feedback or dialogue with your students as you're actually delivering the content. Another thing is that when you are delivering content, it's about pausing at different milestones. So when you have delivered, whether it's the lesson objectives or where you've delivered activity 1, you might want to put a poll in. You might want to put an activity in where you are creating that feedback and giving young people time to respond. I think that's a really important thing, because sometimes we like to, rush through the different tasks and different activities. But if we're creating more opportunity for our students to actually pause, think, digest what we're saying, then being able to respond, giving them different pathways and also routes to be able to respond to you, whether that's online and offline. So these are some of the tips that I've used in my classroom to really inspire my students to really think about, one, if a teacher gives you out an instruction, what are the different ways you can actually communicate with us, and also how do you communicate effectively. And then lastly, I want you to think about, is there any other kind of tools that you can use, whether it's Padlet or Seesaw, that once you are kind of going through that content, students can actually write something into that platform to showcase that they're understanding that. And I think that might be the future in terms of when you are delivering the session, you might have a mood board, or you might have a kind of a kind of working space where students can throw in comments, throw in suggestions as you are delivering the content. So try these 3 things out. Let us know how you get along, and thank you for tuning in to Blend Ed.
Thank you so much, Mark. We shall move seamlessly from recorded Mark into live Mark, and move into the kind of Q&A portion of the session. And I'm going to kick off with the first question, if that's all right, Mark. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to kind of describe your school's journey through remote and blended learning over the last year. So what did you start off doing? And how has that kind of grown and developed and changed based on what worked and what didn't over the course of the last year?
So one of the things that we realized before the pandemic is that we needed to get our VLE in place, and we wanted to ensure that the VLE was able to support students if they were ill or if they didn't attend that lesson, how to catch up with the content. So our first journey started off using OneNote. So it was like a online digital book. So we gave these digital books out to all of our students, and we started to populate that with content and information. And at the time, it took a long time for our students to get used to this technology, because what you'll find with any type of technology, you've got to have a good internet access. You've got to have it to make sure that it syncs the content. So whatever you do in lesson, by the time you get home, that content has synced right through to the different devices. So to our success, it worked very well, and we got a lot of praise from using digital online books. But what was fascinating is that the pandemic then pushed us towards a VLE, a full-fledged VLE. And if you're a teacher, you're probably using Google, Microsoft, or Zoom, or one of these type of VLE platforms or online learning platforms, not only just to showcase work, but to create a learning environment where you can set assignments, where you can set online meetings, you can set schedules, you can share content of work. And what's well for us in this pandemic is the breadth of resources. So a lot of time when people have talked about blended learning, they've talked about it from the premises of just young people just doing stuff online. But actually what we found to be more effective is about creating that ecosystem, so that students can access, whether it's videos, text-based resources, they can access a range of different content, all from this kind of digital resource, and they can also access teachers. So that's one of the, the things that I would say really has changed in this pandemic, is how much teachers have been available and present online to provide information around misconcepts, support, and also doing extracurricular activities. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey.
I've got another question for you, Mark, which is, we talked with those 6 principles about a sense of belonging, and I know that you've also talked a lot about a kind of well-being. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you foster well-being and that sense of belonging within the school, within year groups, within classes.
Thanks for another great question. So this week alone, we've probably ticked a lot of those belonging boxes. So the first one, we done an enrichment day where we was able to invite outside speakers, or I don't even know what that means. We'll probably have to reinvent the name, e-speakers that have spoken to our students about the pandemic, about some of the opportunities that's happening in the industry, and kind of showcase to them that, probably at this current moment of time, you are working remotely, but this might be the future of work. This might be something you might need to become familiar with moving forward. And, apart from having that Richmond Day, we've also done a British Bake Off Day where we sent cake mixes to different families where they were able to make cakes with their children, and then submit the posters back, or submit the photos of what they had done back online. And they, yesterday when we was looking through the different images, it was really like a mind-blowing to see students interacting and families interacting and so forth. And when you look at belonging is not just between the relationship between the teacher and the student. It's about, does that young person belong to this school? Do they belong to the community? Do they belong to society? And one of the things that we really want to focus on with that belonging is to have those different type of ecosystems that those young people can engage in. Before the lockdown, I really wanted to get my young people involved in the community more, because I felt that there was a disconnect between them just coming into a building and them not interacting with the local environment. And what I really wanted to do is to, teach these young people some skills, and then use those skills in local areas that could build up their confidence. Because as I've said before in some of my videos, is that young people want to feel that, their voices are being heard, that they can bring that identity to school, they can bring themselves and not feel alienated by doing that. And especially living in London, where we've got a wide range of diversity amongst our young people. And the best lessons I've had as a teacher is when I've allowed to allowed young people to be themselves and to be innovative and to be creative and think outside of the box. So the power of belonging is way beyond, as I've already mentioned, that relationship between the teacher and the student, but also it's about how do we foster young people to be a part of society, to be a part of the global market now. So before it would probably be part of the EU or be a part of this local European landscape. How do we make our young people to be global citizens? And I think at the heart of that is to make them feel that they belong to that system. Now, just lastly, we have created spaces on the VLA system where young people can, share their ideas and share what's happening around the world, and to contribute to, what's happening in terms of this current landscape. So there are ways that schools can do that by giving students voices, by creating breakout rooms and spaces for young people to talk about the issues and to talk about things that matter to them.
I'm going to go to a question actually from Darren that's in the chat, which says, online seems to come with increased online marking, checking of comments and posts. How does one manage this extra workload?
So one of the things when you're managing blended learning is about having an agreement with your leadership team or with the head teacher. And the head teacher for our school was very realistic in the expectations that one, students, we sent a letter home to all the families to say that teachers will be available from 9 to 3 p.m. So again, there's some boundaries in terms of when students should be contacting you, when parents should be contacting you for support. And then in terms of the marking, we made sure that there was a workload schedule for students and teachers. So during Monday to Friday, students will be given a working timetable, and also teachers will also be having a working timetable. So we'd have the timetable when we would issue the work, and then when students should get some sort of feedback. Now, again, when we gave feedback to students, we gave it back in various forms. So I've used videos, I've used voice notes, I've used text, I've used drop-in sessions. So I've used 4 different ways of giving feedback to reduce my workload. Because if it was just me sitting by a computer doing admin and writing up and giving that critique feedback, I will probably be here till next year. So we've had to be very creative in terms of how do we give feedback to, tackle some of these misconceptions, and how do we give feedback to get young people to move to the next level. But again, that can only be done by the willingness of the leadership team in a school or a head teacher. And if you're not getting that, then you've got to be creative in terms of how you manage your workload. And if you need support, you need to reach out to the relevant stakeholders within the school to give you that support. Or if you feel that you can be creative around that feedback and response, then we can do then that's the right way to go.
Can I add something in there as well? Yesterday we were working with a group of teachers, and there were several schools that were describing some really kind of careful planning in terms of roles and responsibilities. So, one school was talking about how for half the week, that they would split up kind of who was doing the teaching with the children in school, who was doing the online learning, but also there was another school where they were kind of really making it very granular in terms of that planning. So there were actual kind of days across a team, across a year group, where there was a teacher who was actually responsible for the kind of dialogue and the feedback and assessment, and then there was a teacher who was doing the kind of pre-recorded videos, and then there was also a kind of time for each of those teachers in the team to be doing the kind of live check-ins. So they were kind of actually very rigorous, and that seemed to be in that school reducing workload. So I think there's things you can do. And then the other thing that teachers are talking about is like the building up of the kind of bank of pre-recorded videos for things like misconceptions. So and there was a teacher talking about kind of use of Google Forms, where if a student had an answer that demonstrated a misconception, that then it would kind of direct them to the misconception video. But actually then those things can be used again and again, and also with other resources, like they were talking about kind of use of things like White Rose. So I think it's about kind of also some careful planning, and what you say, Mark, about it needing to have school leadership kind of attention and planning. It's just it's even more complex, isn't it, in terms of the timetabling than when everyone's in school.
One of the other things that I'd say is that actually the workload question is one that we have asked many of the teachers that we've interviewed for Blend Ed. So if you search it in our resources section on the website, you'll find probably about 10 different teachers talking about how they're handling the extra workload as well. So there's a lot of different voices on there for people to find and to kind of get nuggets of wisdom from.
And I think it links to the next question in the chat, actually, because the next question in the chat is about excessive screen time for children. But actually, I think we also need to think about excessive screen time for teachers. And so that kind of planning around how much you're doing live, how much you're doing pre-recorded, how, you know, whether you can actually do some of your planning work kind of, you know, pen and paper, to sometimes have those moments away from the screen, and then building in, you know, movement. A couple of years ago, I took a group of teachers to Finland, to the town of Tampere, and they had a whole municipal policy around movement, which meant that every teacher, every child, every council employee and people across the city, they had to build in movement. This is obviously pre-pandemic, but I think, you know, that's another side of it, isn't it? Kind of like the exhaustion factor. Here we are all on screen in the evening, but yeah, it's kind of thinking about that. And then on to that question then in the chat about concerns about excessive screen time. Mark, I'll let you answer that one first, and then Caitlin and I may have some contributions to make as well.
So I've been looking at a range of different researches around the world in terms of screen time, and, you know, what is the most adequate amount of screen time for young people. And one of the articles I was reading was in India, where students were, you know, waking up from 8:30 all the way through to, you know, daytime, looking at screens. And some students complained of their eyes hurting, and so forth. And, you know, one of the things, you know, being a computer scientist is about, you know, if you're in an ICT room, there's ergonomics that you need to take into consideration in terms of having a chair that is, you know, suitable for your back, a table, lighting over a computer, and then also having breaks. Now, we still need to follow that, and schools and young people still need to adhere to those, you know, those guidelines, because it's not just there for the sake of it, it's there to protect us all from injury or damaging our eyesight. And again, we've kind of tried to tackle that by not having so many online lessons. So some of the lessons we set in terms of messaging and setting the content through assignments, but sometimes we do the live sessions where we have to be in front of the computer and so forth. But I think it goes back down to the school's way of how they're timetabling the online and the remote process. And, you know, our school's been very good at, in the sense of managing that timetable. So students know that they've only got 3 to 4 lessons that day. These are the times that we're expecting to take a break. Now, one of the things interesting for me is that I was able to visit a family who have who've got 3 children doing remote learning. And when I went into that sort of environment, it was very chaotic in the sense they had 3 teachers, and the students, the young people didn't have headphones, but they're having 3 different live lessons. And then after those lessons had ended, they all stopped and then went to, you know, get a sandwich, take some time and get some fresh air and back in. So part of that screen time is also parents too, making sure that, you know, their child is not at the computer for a long period of time, similar if they were playing computer games. But I think that you know, the common kind of consensus here is that, you know, teachers, families and schools need to have realistic expectations, and where they're not having realistic expectations, then it needs to be called out.
And I think there's some kind of confusion in the interpretation of kind of the DFE and Ofsted guidance and provision. It's about the provision of education. It's not saying that there should be 5 hours of screen time a day. It's about the amount of learning that's going on. And again, it's kind of back to that planning. So it's sort of, you know, can you have something where you know, the student, the young person does something on paper, and then they can come back to the screen, hold it up, show it to the teacher, have those kind of check-ins, even if it is a live lesson. So you have moments where you know, everyone turns off their cameras and they kind of can just shuffle along the table if there's room. But it's definitely a challenge. And I think, again, the comment in the chat about kind of the need for outdoors, being children to be outdoors in terms of their mental health and well-being is really important. And I've been struck by some of the teachers that we've been working with some of the Nordic countries on several Erasmus projects, just actually how much outdoor learning had been happening kind of since the pandemic, but when children were in school, but kind of making sure that actually lots of the school learning was outdoors, and then certainly kind of teachers trying to plan that in within their lessons.
And one thing there is that it's one of the things that I've seen in terms of, you know, we live in a city, London, and we work with a lot of young people coming from very challenging backgrounds where sometimes they're sharing rooms, sometimes they don't have the space to do remote learning, or you know, they just don't have the physical space to probably even go out because there's dangers. And we've seen over the weekend in terms of some of the youth violence that we've witnessed, and some parents are reluctant to even send their child out to you know, even stretch their legs. That's why I think that's, you know, and I don't want to paint my school to have all the answers, but we've been able to take some of those kids in and have them in school. So if the situation is, the fact is that they're not getting, whether it's the remote learning, you know, equipment issue, or they're not having the opportunity to, you know, do the stuff that we would expect young people to do, whether it was in a school format, we've taken them in this pandemic, and we would class them as vulnerable. And I think schools across the country have done a great job in terms of this pandemic, this cycle of the pandemic, where we've taken a lot more young people into schools, because we are privy of the fact is that some of them are living in very challenging situations.
There's another question that's come through, which is about a specific tool. So it's about Seesaw, and Caitlin, can I direct that one at you, because I know you've done a lot of work with many schools using Seesaw, and particularly for thinking about kind of feedback and assessment and dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. So Seesaw is a learning platform. I would say it's slightly less comprehensive than something like Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams. You're not going to get the whole sort of infrastructure of video calling in there and so forth. But what it is a brilliant platform for sharing work and giving feedback. So it works cross-platform. So you can get it on tablets, on phones, on computers. So it's brilliant in that regard because it works on whatever the kids have got at home, and allows for teachers to set assignments that then are allocated to a certain class or to certain students. And the students can then upload photos of their work onto, or links to their work onto the Seesaw for the teachers to then see. One of the really nice things about it is how easily the feedback mechanisms are kind of built into it, both from the teacher perspective and from the student perspective. And as Mark was talking about earlier, the different forms of feedback. So voice notes are really, really easy through Seesaw. Little bits of film are really easy. Annotating images, putting bits of text. It's all built into the platform to be as simple to do as possible. Which means that you can get that dialogue and that back and forth really, really quickly, and allowing the teachers to kind of catch misconceptions nice and easily, but also allowing for students to comment as well, which you can do, and ask questions. So Mark, I don't know if you're using it in your setting, but I'm a big fan.
Yeah, we haven't used it in my setting, but I am familiar that there are similar tools that have that functionality. And you know, I've been really privileged over the years to introduce new tools if I see that it has some potential. So if there is a possibility of exploring Seesaw and having the power of Seesaw in your school, then it's always a great recommendation for the head teacher to put on the budget for the following year, or to recommend he or she puts on the budget for the following year.
Yeah, one of the nice things with Seesaw as well is that there is a free version and then there is a paid version. If it's something that's going to be rolled out across the whole school, the paid version does have some brilliant functionality that I think is for the best. But if you're testing it out, if you want to have a go with it, if you want to kind of convince senior leadership that it's a good thing to go with, the free version is really good. And we actually wrote a blog that I will dig out and put in the notes to this session about how to make the most of the free version of Seesaw. So that's back in our blog archive. So I will dig that one out and pop it on there as well.
And just sticking on kind of different tools for a moment, another big favourite of ours at the Connected Learning Centre is Padlet. And in fact, we were involved in a project with UNICEF where an entire country's learning has actually been set on Padlet, and we were doing some training around that. So every grade has their lessons put up on Padlet every week. So it's a big favourite of ours in terms of kind of low bandwidth. You can add audio, you can add video, you can have links. Children can comment, and they can even do ratings. Anyway, lots of functionalities. That's another kind of one from us. How about you, Mark? Any kind of top tools?
Yeah, similar. So we've tried to use, so a lot of these VLE platforms provide a lot of add-on tools and plug-in tools. So we've tried to use some tools where students know, like if you was in a school, you would have these kind of whiteboards to write notes on. Now there are VLE platforms now that have that embedded in their system. So the teacher can say, hey, give them a question or prompt or a low stake question, and then students can then respond by having these kind of interactive whiteboards where they can mark on to give feedback. And then that's similar to Padlet, right? So as you are going through a session, you can have a range of different things within Padlet that you can interact with. Also, polls have been pretty good in terms of like voting and seeing people's reaction when you're talking. But in terms of any specific tools, there's so much out there. I don't want to give any more to what's already in the market, but there might be some tools that I have been looking at around skill development and soft skills. So how do we develop young people, not only just to be great content users or app users within the curriculum, or what are the apps and tools that are available outside of that can empower them, not only just in school, but outside of school too. So we have been looking at a range of different public speaking tools. How do you present yourself? How do you get your message across clearly in terms of understanding topics? The holy grail for me would be to have a tool that is able to, that students can then take on with them once they leave school and build out their professional portfolio. So that's the kind of area that I'm looking at quite heavily. GitHub is one, because obviously I'm a computer science teacher in computing, where they can showcase their professional code. But what else tools can we help that are transferable into the real world? And that's the big challenge for myself.
Some other questions that we've got for you, Mark. So with these days, people are talking quite a lot about kind of learning design as we're kind of planning for online lessons rather than just simple lesson planning. I mean, I guess learning design is lesson planning, but are there any particular things that you think teachers need to be thinking about when they are designing teaching and learning that's going to be done online?
So when I designed a learning course, so when I design learning courses, I normally follow my model, not to be biased, which is the teacher routine, which is 6 steps. So first of all, it's about how do we want to connect with that young person, and that connection could be low stake quizzes. It could be the lesson objective, where they get to present the lesson objective or get to present the content of the lesson, giving them a leadership role within that. And then the next step would be to demonstrate what they need to learn. So again, having different scaffoldings or levels. Traditionally, we've had all, some, or most as like objectives that we want to get students to. I've been able to remix that and say, well, what about being stable or being foundation or excelling? So it's about changing the words of leveling. I think that's been great in terms of my learning design process. Also around activating the learning. So how do we do that effectively? How do we set tasks? How do we know that students can go away and do that independently? Do they have enough resources? Do we give them enough steps before they ask the teacher? So one of the things that we was pushing in schools before lockdown is, first of all, check your textbook. Check the the curriculum book that we've given you with all of the content in there. Ask your buddy or ask your friend, then ask the teacher. So again, we're giving them different avenues and access to basically challenge their kind of thought process. And I'd love to try and do that with my VLE system, where if a student gets stuck within my learning design, they can then have, apart from just texting me, the teacher, to give them a response, they can put it in a channel where it looks at misconceptions. They can put a screen print, they could put a voice note, they could put a picture of the work that they're stuck on, and then seeing if their peers are then able to help them with that process. So that also covers my collaboration piece when I think about design learning. And how do we get young people to collaborate more online and offline? How do we get them to talk about the learning experience? So, long gone are the days where we just set a starter, main activity, and plenary, and the lessons done. I think it's about how do we put in a range of different activities that's going to keep the young person engaged. And then lastly, talking about the plenary, lots of schools across the country do the exit pass. So like, to leave the lesson, you need to have an exit pass or some type of kind of activity. How can we do that online? How can we diversify our plenaries so that students can leave that session, and then whether they want to go away and do it independently, do some more research, or make sure that they're prepared for the next lesson that's ahead of them. So again, my learning design is pretty much scattered, but it's scattered in a way that, one, it's all about making sure that the learning journey it doesn't just end in that lesson or end online. It's planting the seed for students to go away and to nurture and to blossom, and for teachers then to help them with the pruning of that.
Thank you. There's a question that's come through on the chat about effective badging programs. I'm in notes. Digital badges is something that we were involved in a few years ago with an adult learning scheme, actually, with supporting adults with kind of basic skills around digital skills. I mean, there are things like open badge and badger. But I think, if you're in a school, it might be something that you want to link to your VLE, but you could go out to something like open badges. I don't know, Mark, have you done anything with digital badges at all?
Yeah, so we started. It's nearly coming up for probably about 8 years since we kind of explored digital badges, even from the Mozilla days, if you can remember. They were trying to think about, could they use digital badges that would transcend a young person outside of the school environment. Now, that conversation is broken down because of the politics, the amount of people or stakeholders outside of schools you need to tick the box with. But I still think that digital badges is the way forward, because if you go on LinkedIn now, an adult's professional environment, you can see lots of individuals that have gone onto LinkedIn Learning and got badges that now make them more employable. We've adopted badges, so we're using Skills Builder that has over 8 competencies, And every time we see that competency within the student, we award them that badge of acknowledgement. Now, I think there is a power. You might want to make your own badges. In the past, I've tried to make my own badges, but I fell short because I wasn't consistent with them. I didn't hand them out enough. I forgot them at some juncture where some students remembered. So if you're going to, embed a badge system within your school, one, you need to look at consistency. Number two, again, it's always great when you got backing from your line manager or SLT with the momentum so they can support it beyond you. And then lastly, it's about how do we keep kids motivated? Because if you get students that have got all the badges, what's the next step for them? What's the benefit for them? How do they see themselves being recognized for the achievement that they're making? Did the badges sit in there in the virtual folder, or do we have some kind of physical reward or physical personal statement that we can actually help them with to make them more employable or to fill out their UCAS or university or college application?
And I think it is a point, isn't it, kind of when everything's online, that you need some kind of visible recognition and for the kind of like trace of your learning. Just looking at time, I know we also wanted to think a little bit about kind of future, didn't we, Caitlin? And we've got a couple of questions. I know you've got one that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, so obviously we are speaking now in February of 2021, for those watching the recorded version of this. So we are currently in lockdown. A majority of students are learning remotely from home, with some in school, but we are hoping that in the not too distant future that there might be more students coming back into school. So Mark, now that the blended learning genie is out of the bottle, what do you think teachers need to be doing now in order to prepare for the time when a majority of their students are back in the classroom?
Another great question. So I think one of the biggest things that we need to be thinking about is young people's mental health and well-being. I always say that, once students know that we care for them and we understand that, lockdown has been difficult, online learning has been a journey, that, we're going to be here to answer or to support them, because some of them have been panicked during lockdown. We've had a lot of students that have had a lot of anxiety because they've missed out on a lot of content of work, and then they shut down. So even though they're more than capable of doing the work, they've just shut down because of that overwhelming feeling that, oh my Lord, I'm not keeping up with stuff. So what we're planning to do is have a session where a well-being and mental health session to get them back into the groove of stuff. And then when they are back in school, we're going to start planning about how can we effectively deliver content that they've missed out on. How do we get them back to a standard, especially for those students that are in their first year of courses? For the students doing their second year, we're still waiting for the DFE to really think about, what is it that we need to do as a teaching body to really get these young people into colleges and universities. And so to answer the question, it's very mixed, but one of my strong advice I would say to teachers really thinking about what is it that I need to be doing is sometimes it's about doing less. It's about understanding the situation that we're in, understanding that, half of the resources that we've done and produced, we can reuse that again. So that's a brilliant point from what Sarah is saying around how can we reuse some of this content that we've been doing online to support students going forward. And then lastly, I would also probably think about for schools, really to think about how do we kind of stream this now. So we don't know if we're going to be in a lockdown again. We don't know, what's going to happen for the remainder of this academic year. But one, we need to have a realistic expectation in terms of that workload and commitment. So I obviously I'm not the person with the silver bullet, but all I can do is talk from a personal experience and also a general feeling from teachers at the moment that we don't have all the answers in terms of, this is students should be doing A, B, and C, or schools should be doing A, B, and C. But what we need to be thinking about is one, the mental health of our colleagues who are teachers and students, and then thinking about what is the realistic expectation for the summer term that we need to complete.
Thank you, Mark. And then looking a bit further ahead into the future, can you say a bit about how you think this whole experience of rapid change and training of teachers and using such a range of digital technologies, how do you think that's going to affect teaching kind of going even further forward in terms of, like, everyone's been so incredibly inventive and skilled? How do you see education looking when hopefully we're kind of back in the classroom, but really, really adept at using digital?
So I think that online learning is here to stay. I think it's going to be a bigger piece to our way of working, whether we work in schools or we work in the industry. There was a report that came out last week where, you know, some people are getting used to the lifestyle of remote working from home. And then, you know, when we look at our university, so I teach at university, and we've got a lot of our students working from home in that capacity. And then when I look in secondary schools, yes, we'll be coming back into a physical building, but I think that there is a real opportunity now in terms of, one, do the DFE, do the the people that set out these exams, make it project based. So this is one thing that we've always spoken about, but we never ever got there because we felt that exams was the end point to a young person's learning. But apart from the blended ed in terms of having school and remote learning, we might need to have a blended exam. So probably I'm setting the president here, and whoever looks on in a senior position looks at this and takes it seriously, that in the sense that if we have a blended examination or moderation for young people, then it gives us the ability then to really powerhouse with this remote working. It gives us a great potential, not only just to mark a student on their memory of how well they've remembered the exam, but also bring their creativity, bring more innovation, and bring more productivity to the young person. Because imagine during lockdown, a student could have worked on maths, English, and science to help solve some of the crises of COVID, and using all of their different skills and subjects. That would be awesome. And then putting that into some type of portfolio and then presenting that as a piece. So I think that going forward, yes, remote learning is here to stay. Blend ed is here to stay too. And also, last but not least, I think that the way we look at exams is going to change significantly if it's not already being changed now.
I mean, it feels like the questions that we've had today from people that have joined us, and the themes that we've set for our blended programme is that it does feel like it's all about kind of iterating the whole time, doesn't it? And we're looking back over this past year, how much we've all learned, how much more sophisticated and thoughtful and specific the learning design has become with remote learning. The fact that the teaching profession are now so able to kind of do this actual proper blending. So going between being in school, teaching children that are in front of them in class one day, the next day doing remote, planning for both of those scenarios, the kind of going between kind of lockdown and back into school. I think it just feels like everyone's become incredibly skilled and incredibly thoughtful, and that what we've all had to do is be much more explicit in our teaching and our planning for teaching. So doing what we've already been doing, but then having to do that in a much more explicit way. So that feels for me like a kind of summary of what it's like now to be an educator in a blended learning world.
Awesome. And I think for myself is that for the last probably 50 years, there's always been this challenge for teachers to think how agile are teachers, how resilient are teachers alongside young people. And I think that this pandemic has shown the world that, you know, education is here to stay, whether it's in a physical space or whether it's an online space. And as you're saying, Sarah, I totally agree that, you know, I don't think there's going to be a fixed model to this. It's going to be forever evolving. I see it as an organism where it changes to the climate and time that we're in. And I think that we're in a great time in the sense that, you know, there are a lot of challenges with remote learning. But I think that if we can, you know, it'd be interesting to see the impact that this will make for generations to come, in the sense that we could decentralize learning, not just only in the classroom. We can take it wherever we go. We're lifelong learners. We can learn from our home. We can learn in our communities. We can learn in a range of different spaces. And, you know, I don't know whether the new skills that are being formed out of this remote learning, that we can say we're more independent. We've been speaking about independent learning for decades. But again, this is some of that, encouraging that for students to then take content that we teach remote learning with, and then to do that independently. And then lastly, I think in terms of being innovative and creative, so that's one of my biggest pieces from this. Apart from young people doing remote learning at home, we've seen them, you know, use technology to print off PPE equipment for the NHS. We've seen them build websites. We've seen them build food bank campaign pages to help their local communities. So let's not say everything that young people have been doing online at home has not just been academic and curriculum based. But then again, the challenge for us as schools, how do we embrace that? How do we embrace some of this innovation and creativity that young people are doing, and make it a more richer and a more appealing curriculum for all of those involved?